Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is wonderful to have you all here today in the elegant Fullerton Hall at the Art Institute of Chicago for today's program. I am Nora Gaynor, Executive Director of Civic Relations and Partnerships here at the museum, and I am delighted that you are joining us this afternoon to learn about Swami Vivekananda's groundbreaking speech at the World's Parliament of Religions at the Chicago 1893 Columbian Exposition. As we begin, a gentle reminder to please silence your mobile phone. Thank you so much. Again, it is my pleasure to welcome you today with Dr. Madhuvanti Ghose. Dr. Ghose is the inaugural Alsdorf Associate Curator of Indian, Southeast Asian, and Himalayan art in the Arts of Asia Department. Since joining the museum in 2007, she opened the beautiful Alsdorf Galleries in 2008 and has curated and organized numerous exhibitions and installations, including Public Notice 3 by Jitish Kalat in 2010, India Modern, the paintings of M.F. Hussain in 2017, among many others that she will share with us today in her remarks. From 2012 to 2016, Madhu led the Vivekananda Memorial Program for Museum Excellence, funded by the Government of India and designed to foster professional exchange between the Art Institute and museums in India. In 2020 and 21, she presented a series of virtual workshops on museum curation for the American Institute of Indian Studies as part of the Strengthening U.S.-India Professional Collaboration Initiative supported by the U.S. Mission to India. Prior to joining the Art Institute, Madhu was lecturer in South Asian art and archaeology at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. She completed her doctoral dissertation from the University of London and was a research fellow at the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford University. Her current research interests include the art of the Pushti Marg sect, the Indian cultural doyen, Pupul Jayakar, and the textiles of Bengal. This program is generously sponsored by J.P. Morgan Chase and Company. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Madhuvanti Ghose to the stage.
Thank you so much, Nora. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Consul General, distinguished guests, friends. First of all, I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to my colleagues at the Art Institute. Besides Nora, an entire team, starting with Joe, Cassie, and others, have put this lecture together and have supported me for months. So I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to all of them. You know, for some of you, this is just an auditorium. But for many of us here today, this is a very special space. And we get countless visitors every year who wish to just come and gaze at this space. And the reason that they want to come sometimes and gaze at an empty auditorium is because of this person, Swami Vivekananda. And I know that many of you present here today know a lot about him. And perhaps I won't be adding to your knowledge at all, other than some happy reminiscences of knowing about Swami Vivekananda from your childhood. But for others, I think it is an important moment to not just remember who he was, but what his contributions have been to Indians and South Asians who are today spread out across the world and are amongst us in America today. Because it tells us also about a moment in our American history where there was this first important exchange of ideas between the East and the West. And it happened in this very space where you're sitting here today. And that is the story that I'm going to try to unfold to you today, this afternoon. Recently, we were honored by a visit from the Ministry of Culture of the Government of India, but they are amongst just one reference. We get visitors daily who are nameless, who come just to look at this space. And the story that I'm going to share with you is why that's the case. Within the South Asian culture and Hinduism, there is this concept of darshan, which essentially means the exchange of glances. It means observing, looking at something, and through that looking of paying your respects, your obeisance. And that is what people come all over the world, to actually just stand and experience this space. So this, in my opinion, has become part of the sacred landscape of important spaces outside of South Asia. In fact, I often say that this is perhaps one of the most important sacred spaces outside of South Asia, but I am a little biased. So what was the story of this unknown monk who is largely forgotten in the West today, but still carries so much emotion for people from the Indian subcontinent? This unknown monk starts off life as a humble Bengali. He grew up as Narendranath Datta, who was born in colonial India in 1863 in what was then the capital of British India, Calcutta, present-day Kolkata. He was born in the home of a lawyer. His father was Vishwanath Datta, who was practicing law and was an erudite man. And Naren grew up in an environment full of inquiry, a time when he was exposed to the best of Western ideas as well as that of Indian. The second half of the 19th century was a time of tremendous intellectual and quest within Bengal. Bengal was the earliest part of the South Asian subcontinent that came under colonial British rule. And as a result of the introduction of Western education in the 1830s, by the 1860s, when Naren was growing up, Calcutta was a cosmopolitan place. People were exposed to Western education, but that did not mean that they did not also have an understanding of their own educational systems. In fact, there was a very progressive movement in Bengal at this time, and Naren studied in the school that was started by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. But this was a moment of what we have come to call the Bengal Renaissance, and there were many ideas that he was exposed to, including in the milieu that he was in, to the ideas of the Brahmo Samaj, which was very much in favor of reforming Hinduism, and especially taking out some of the practices that they felt demeaned women. In this kind of period of intellectual stimulation as he was growing up, as he was going to school and going to college, exposed to the best of ideas, he heard about a mystic called Ramakrishna Paramahansa. Ramakrishna was the priest of the temple of the goddess Kali at Dakshineshwar. And he had become renowned at this time for his mystical and his spiritual, not just teachings, but in fact, he was constantly having these mystical turns. And the young Naren, the teenager Naren, was very curious. And so he decided to go to meet Ramakrishna. And there are incredible stories about their first meeting, where for a moment, Ramakrishna kind of clutched him to his bosom and said, "Where have you been all this time?" And Naren, with all his questing mind, was like, "Hang on a minute, who is this person?" And but he couldn't help himself. Ramakrishna's personality was so magnetic that he felt that, he couldn't help himself. He wanted to go back and meet Ramakrishna over and over again. And the questions that he would ask Ramakrishna, were all part of the education that he'd had. His mind was full of questions, shaped as he was by the Bengal of that time. But in Ramakrishna, he had found his guru. And eventually, he realized that, he had to succumb to his guru. And but this was really the last stage of Ramakrishna's life, because very soon after Ramakrishna passed away in 1886. At that moment, Naren, who had transformed into a monk, along with the other disciples of Ramakrishna, felt kind of orphaned. In his own personal life, he had been going through a transformation as well, because his father had passed away. And they suddenly realized that they were poor, and they didn't have the kind of middle-class trappings that they thought they had. And when Ramakrishna also suddenly passed away, so soon after Naren had found him, he felt very troubled. And along with the rest of the other disciples of Ramakrishna, they all for a while lived together in a little house. But eventually they all decided to lead the life of a monk and leave the trappings of society and start wandering. And that led to a long period of time between 1887 and 93, when Vivekananda, as he started slowly to be called, started to traverse the length and breadth of South Asia. Leading the life of a monk in India, to a certain extent, there is a path, in the sense that you basically leave the trappings of your home, you leave your name, your entitlements, and you live on whatever people offer you, and you journey to see many places, and especially you go to important sites of pilgrimage. And that is the journey that Vivekananda embarked upon, which took him to the tips of the Himalayas and to the southernmost tip of India, to Kanyakumari as well. And along the way, he was exposed to the real India, because now he was no longer in British India. He was actually traversing the country, seeing extreme poverty. He was seeing rulers, the native states, and he was traveling through parts of India that was under the colonial yoke. So he was seeing India as it really was, not from his cocoon of Calcutta and a life of some privilege. And it was during these travels across the length and breadth of India, especially in southern India, that many people that he came across started to suggest to him that he should consider going to Chicago for the World Parliament. There was clearly a buzz in India at that time amongst people who would hear Vivekananda speak that he should go to the World Parliament. People had heard about this World Parliament that was going to take place in faraway Chicago. Eventually, several of the local Rajas and other followers of Vivekananda put together some donations. And the Raja that you see here, Ajit Singh, of a small principality called Khetri, eventually was one amongst many to suggest that Vivekananda should travel to Chicago, and they all put together donations. And the Raj of Khetri, in fact, gave him a turban, which became such a distinctive part of Swamiji's attire, which lots and lots of people commented on in Chicago. He embarked by ship on the 31st of May in 1893 and traveled via Colombo and Southeast Asia and China and Japan, and eventually arrived in Vancouver in July of 1893, and then traveled by train from Vancouver to Chicago, only to realize that the Parliament didn't start till September. This was a time when Chicago was abuzz, and this was the time when the Columbian Exposition was taking place in Chicago. So Vivekananda did go. He spent about a couple of weeks here and visited the fair. He was tremendously impressed, as were most of the visitors to the fair at this time, by America and its progress, and all the developments that one could see at the fair. But he soon realized that two things. Number one, you needed to have a formal invitation. You had to have bona fide credentials to be able to speak at the World Parliament, which he did not have, and that his money was running out very fast. So he knew that he couldn't, with the amount of money he had left, he couldn't stay in Chicago until September. And at this time, he remembered that he had met on his train journey from Vancouver an elderly Bostonian lady by the name of Catherine Sanborn. And he remembered that she had kindly invited him. They had had such an engaged conversation in the train. She had kindly said to him that, well, if you are ever in Boston, you should come by. And so he decided to get up on a train and go and visit her in Boston. And she did welcome him and opened her house and her contacts to him. And amongst the many people she introduced him to was Professor John Wright, who was the professor of classical philology at Harvard. This was a time when Vivekananda would impress everyone that he would speak to. And it was Professor Wright who suggested and encouraged him to actually speak about Hinduism at the World Parliament. He even helped him buy a ticket back to Chicago and gave him letters of introduction, but for some reason, he lost those invitations. And so when he came back to Chicago, he spent the night in an empty wagon. And then in the morning, when he was despairing about what might happen next, he came across the lady that he started to call his mother and his adopted family, so to speak, in Chicago, the Hale family. He came across Mrs. Hale. By then, I think Chicagoans of a certain sort had gotten used to seeing foreigners in their midst, and she assumed that he might have come for the World Parliament. And so she kindly took him in. And when he explained what had happened to him, she took him across to meet John Barrows, Reverend John Barrows, who was the chairman of the General Committee that was responsible for the World Parliament, and got him admitted to the Parliament. So at this point, I'd like to pause for a second and let's look at what was happening in Chicago at that time, because this indeed was a very, very special summer in Chicago, the summer of the Columbian Exposition. I think most of you here today know that Chicago had been devastated by the Great Fire of 1871. And Chicago was going through this enormous period of change, and a great building effort was happening after the Great Fire. And at this time, there was a buzz amongst the different cities of America because the 400th anniversary was coming up of Christopher Columbus's journey to America, and which happened in 1492. And so different cities were invited to bid to host this exposition. This was a time after the Crystal Palace 1851 exhibition, the Great Exhibition of 1851, at the time of Queen Victoria, and put together largely through the efforts of her husband, Prince Albert. There was a great craze for international exhibitions that showed the wonders of the age, all the new discoveries, to the citizens of the West. And so a series of such exhibitions took place in London, across the continent, and even in the colonies, even in India and in Australia. And so it was decided through an act of Congress that America was going to host the Columbian Exposition, and the different cities were asked to bid to see who could host it. And to everyone's surprise, the underdog, because one was competing with the great cities on the East Coast, and New York was, everyone assumed, would win this exposition, but in fact, they didn't have an appropriate space. And to everyone's surprise, Chicago won this, the right to do the Columbian Exposition. And this was a great moment for the city to showcase itself. And so the great and the good of the city all came together to make the most of this opportunity to reimagine the city after the Great Fire. And here are a couple of images of the Columbian Exposition. It came to be known as the White City because of these great, grand palaces that were created to celebrate the different areas of progress. And they gleamed, their white plaster gleamed at night and looked like, so it came to be called the White City. Over 28 million people came to visit the Columbian Exposition and to take part and to enjoy its different spaces. And this, of course, was the moment when the Ferris wheel became the greatest hit. It was shown for the first time. And the impact of the Columbian Exposition, if you're a Chicagoan, you know, because all of our great cultural and educational institutions, libraries, even the symphony, everything goes back to the Columbian Exposition and to the leaders of Chicago at that time who were the driving force behind all of these other cultural institutions that came up as a result. Now, it is an interesting thing to note that there was an India pavilion, but it was designed by a Chicago architect, not an Indian, and by somebody called Henry Cobb. And what was funny about it was that the government of India was not involved in paying for it. For some reason, it was actually a lot of merchants and particularly those who were in the tea trade got involved, and so one could come and sip tea and enjoy tea. And many of the princes of the time helped to sponsor this pavilion. And it really didn't have the kind of impact that, for example, the Phoenix pavilion had, where the Japanese government had actively gotten involved and used this as an opportunity to expand its cultural influence through this the Columbian Exposition. In contrast, the pavilions of the different parts of the world were essentially Western European. Now, it is in this milieu that the Art Institute also starts to evolve. Now, the Art Institute existed prior to this. It had been founded in 1879 as the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, and its name was changed in 1882. But and even though it had its own custom-built new home at Michigan and Van Buren, the site today is the site of the present-day Chicago Club, we had already outgrown that space. And so the trustees of the Art Institute, and particularly the president of its board, Charles Hutchinson, was looking around for a new home. Now, what is key to all of these cultural institutions, including the Art Institute, is that you have the same set of people who are, on one hand, in the leadership of the Columbian Exposition, as well as behind the rest of these cultural entities that are coming up at this time. And so Charles Hutchinson had a role on the city commissions. He was involved in a very key way with what was happening at the exposition as well. And so he was able to persuade and start negotiating with the city of Chicago for a building in a prominent location. And the location that they eventually wanted was the site that you're seeing up here, the Illinois Interstate Industrial Exposition Building, which was on this crossing of Adams and Michigan Avenue. Remember that the rest of the Columbian Exposition buildings were all on the south side of Chicago by Jackson Park. And the decision to be here was a very major one. And it looked almost like they were not going to succeed. They wanted to be near downtown, in the heart of the city. But eventually, because of everyone was interconnected with everybody else, they were able to get the spot that they wanted. And thus, the permanent home of the Art Institute became this very site, the site that was off the Illinois interstate, which was never supposed to be a permanent building. And this is where eventually the new building of the Art Institute started to be imagined. The process of designing it and the selection of its architects, because so many of the buildings at this time, as a result of the Columbian Exposition, were all kind of exploring the classical. It isn't surprising that they plumbed for a Beaux-Arts building designed by the Boston firm of Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. And so it was built jointly by the city of Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition on what is actually landfill. This area of Chicago is landfill from the debris of the Great Fire. And the World's Congress auxiliaries of the World Columbian Exposition took place in this building between 1st May and October 31st, 1893. So essentially, the World's Parliament was one of these auxiliaries of the Columbian Exposition, which took place in this building, which at that time was called the Permanent Memorial Art Palace. And the Art Institute takes it over after the World Parliament finishes. So over 17 days in September, between 11th and 27th of September in 1893, this building housed the World Parliament of Religions, which was led, as we've noted earlier, by Reverend John Henry Barrows, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Chicago. And he was the chairman of its general committee. Now, if you look at the participants at the World Parliament, Barrows publishes these extensive, speeches, the participants, etc., you will see a preponderance actually of people of different denominations of Christianity. Because the way in which it was designed, the parliament was really not about an engagement of the East and the West or of other religions along with Christian ideas. It was essentially, along with the Columbian Exposition, its intent was to actually show the supremacy of Christianity, of the West, through its century of progress. And so you have to understand Vivekananda and the other 1920 of the Indian participants and the rest of the Asian participants in that light, that they were very much the other who were present to showcase their points of view, but essentially the parliament was very much stacked in numbers against them. And it is with that kind of thing in one's mind that you need to look at and hear Swami Vivekananda's speech at the inaugural section. So this space that we are sitting and standing in today is what was known as the Hall of Columbus at the time. It was a temporary stadia, and this map of the ground floor of the Art Institute shows you very clearly that there were two spaces at this time: the Hall of Columbus on one side, which is where we are today, and on the other side, the Hall of Washington. But the main sessions took place in the Hall of Columbus, which could seat approximately 4,000 people. And so it is in this space that on the 11th of September in 1893, during the inaugural session, the great and the good were all getting up and saying a few words, and there was one person left. And eventually Barrows turned to Swami Vivekananda and said, if you're going to speak during this session, then this is your moment. And he got up, and the rest of the speech that he presented was completely extempore. And I know that some of you have probably been given this card when you came in. It does have the speech on the back of it. And what I'd like to do right now is read just tiny portions of it. I hope you will have an opportunity to read the speech later. So Swamiji starts by saying, "Sisters and brothers of America." And from everything that we have heard, not just from him, but also from the records of the following day, it seems that at that moment, there was a thunderous applause that greeted his greeting to the audience. And then the rest of the speech follows. "It fills my heart with joy unspeakable to rise in response to the warm and cordial welcome which you have given us. I thank you in the name of the most ancient order of monks in the world. I thank you in the name of the mother of religions. And I thank you in the name of millions and millions of Hindu people of all classes and sects." I'll just read some other short sections of the speech. "I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. I am proud to belong to a nation which has sheltered the persecuted and the refugees of all religions and all nations of the earth." And then he goes on, "I will quote to you, brethren, a few lines from a hymn which I remember to have repeated from my earliest boyhood, which is every day repeated by millions of human beings. As the different streams, having their sources in different paths which men take, through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee." And he carries on, "Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant, fanaticism, have long possessed this beautiful earth. They have filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now. But their time is come, and I fervently hope that the bell that tolled this morning in honor of this convention may be the death knell of all fanaticism, of all persecutions with the sword or with the pen, and of all uncharitable feelings between persons wending their way to the same goal." Well, that speech became the hit of the day. And thousands came over the next 16 days of the World Parliament to hear Swamiji speak. He spoke on many occasions, as did the other Indians and Asians who were present. But the newspaper articles would often talk not just of what he would was saying, but in fact about his demeanor, his presence, how gorgeous he looked in his turban and his orange garb. As I noted earlier, he was not the only person from India. There were many other people who represented other faiths as well as different aspects of Indian faiths. For example, there were representatives who spoke about the Brahmo Samaj and Hinduism too. Veer Chand Gandhi, who you see here, spoke about Jainism. And Angarika Dharmapal, who you see in white in this image, spoke about Buddhism with great eloquence, as did many of the representatives from Japan. Dharmapal particularly went on to play an active role with the Mahabodhi Society, and especially one of the things that he was very focused on was the restoration of Bodh Gaya. So there were active engagements, of course, between the Asian participants, but also tremendous scope for dialogue with the rest of the participants. But what is really interesting to us today is the fact that for local Chicagoans, especially the women of Chicago, whenever, for example, there would be a slow session or Barrows would often put Swamiji at the end of a session so that people would stay because he knew that Vivekananda had such command over the audiences that people would stay just to hear him speak. So during the rest of the parliament, as well as for the 4 years after the parliament that Swamiji stayed in America, he spoke often, he traveled all over, and this is the time when America is introduced to yoga and to Vedanta. He eventually returned back to India to an incredible reception in 1897 when he arrived back first in Colombo and then eventually Calcutta. And I think the thing that today we forget, even those of us who are Indian or Indian American, is that the world that Vivekananda was coming back to, and the reason why his speech far away in Chicago was so important, was that this was a colonial world that he was coming back to, a world in which Indians had not yet started to fight for independence. This was prior to the partition of Bengal and the start of the Swadeshi movement. He's coming back in 1897 to an India that is not an India in the sense of a united place. This is a place which is very fragmented, but they have heard about his success in the West, in America, so far away. And he, through his message, was giving them a sense of pride that they too needed to stand up and learn the best from America and to stand up and alleviate poverty and move forward. So his message was a very positive one when he comes back. And he suddenly has the platform so that his message is able to be heard. He founds the Ramakrishna Mission on 1st May 1897. He's very impressed. His exchange with the West was not just a one-way speaking, that he was trying to convert. He was never interested in converting anyone. And instead, he was also learning and absorbing. So he talks a great deal about the positive experiences he has here, the energy of the American people, their innovation, their creativity. And so one of the things he takes back is this missionary idea. And so he sets up and founds his Ramakrishna Mission. And then he returns back in 1899 to the US. primarily because he needs money to run the mission. So he comes back, and this is when he founds the many Vedanta societies, especially the one in California. And during this trip, as well as the previous one, of course, many Western, both Europeans and Americans, start to become his followers. And he is accompanied, in fact, on this second trip to America by Sister Nivedita, who is an Irish disciple of his, who left to go and spend the rest of her days in India, following the master. In fact, she eventually writes his memoirs. And Sister Nivedita goes on to play a much more proactive role after Vivekananda's passing, with her nationalist writings, with her writings on Indian art. She is one of the first to articulate a Swadeshi, a nationalist art. And she writes profusely and is very much in the circle around the Tagores and others in that intellectual milieu of Calcutta in the early part of the 20th century. But in the case of Swamiji, sadly, before he turned 40, at the age of 39, in 1902, he passed away. And but the thing he leaves behind is his missionary, his mission, the Ramakrishna mission, and with its center at Belur Math, which is just outside of Calcutta today. And his missionaries, the monks of his order, are now spread across the whole of the world. And it is such a privilege for us to welcome some of his monks here with us today. So Vivekananda, of course, is credited today with having raised the profile of Hinduism to that of a world religion through his many speeches. And he launched this East-West dialogue, which continues right up to the present. But let's turn back at the end to what happens at the Art Institute. So the Art Institute takes possession of this building as the World Parliament finishes. And we take possession of the building from the 1st of November, and there is a formal opening on the 8th of December, 1893. We still celebrate that day. And this space that you're in is, of course, eventually refurbished. The Art Institute initially did not have much of a collection. It was really primarily an art school, and the collection slowly started to come. It started off with a whole host of plaster casts, which was very common at the time, and eventually the trustees slowly started to build up its world-famous collection over the rest of the 1890s and, of course, the early part of the 20th century. Important trustees like Charles Hutchinson, who was one of our longest-serving presidents of the Board of Trustees, and another dear friend of his from the board, Martin Ryerson, embarked on global travels at this time, as did many of the trustees, these founding trustees. And Ryerson and Hutchinson spent quite a bit of time in India in the middle of their Asian travels. And the origins of our Indian art collections go back to Martin Ryerson and his travels to India at this time. This space, Fullerton Hall, was created in 1898. And the space that you're seeing with the Tiffany Dome was created at that time. It was renovated more recently in the late 1990s. And that is when it took its present form. At the time of the centenary of the World Parliament, as well as the Columbian Exposition in 1993 and 1994, through the efforts of many of the Indian American community members who were increasing their presence in Chicago, the street outside the Art Institute was named the Honorary Swami Vivekananda Way. And it was at that time in 1994 that a plaque, a small bronze plaque, was put up outside Fullerton Hall, and some of you may remember that plaque. It was at the time that Dr. Pratapaditya Pal was a visiting curator at the Art Institute. But eventually, in 2012, we refreshed the plaque. The government of India had approached us to put up something within this space. And so the vestibule of this hall is where the new plaque was put up on the 28th of January in 2012. I hope that when you all are leaving, you're able to see that plaque. And that was also the occasion for us signing an agreement with the government of India, which led to us starting what was called the Vivekananda Museum Excellence Program, and under which many museum leaders and museum professionals from some of India's biggest museums came to the Art Institute for training, and we would go back and train them as well in India. And of course, as you can imagine, everybody wanted a picture by the plaque. For those of you who were not here in the 2010s, I want to finish by talking about another project that I did soon after I came here. To show you that Vivekananda's legacy is still a very active one in the memory of the Art Institute. And so in 2010, I worked with the contemporary Indian artist Jitish Kalath to create what was called Public Notice 3 on the grand staircase outside. So the grand staircase of the Art Institute had been constructed in 1910, and it became the site of the words of Swamiji's inaugural address. Jitish had done a series of works, installations on historic utterances, and he really wanted to do Public Notice 3 at the Art Institute. And so because he realized that there were 108 years. 108 years is a very auspicious number in Hinduism, between Swamiji's speech on 11th of September 1893 and another 11th of September 2001, 9/11. And so in remembrance of this speech, which talked about tolerance and about the need for understanding between people, he wanted to remind people of Swamiji's words here in the very site where that original speech had taken place. And the colors that you see are the colors at that time that we associated with Homeland Security. You might remember that there was the longest time when everything was code orange. And so those colors were put through a computer program and then dispersed across these words, which were, the entire speech was put up on our grand staircase. And if you walk up our grand staircase, you will see that it spreads, it divides into the 4 cardinal directions. And so it takes the form of the fact that these words are kind of going into the air. because the Art Institute once upon a time had a plan to have a dome, but in fact that dome was never finished. And so when you walk up and you're coded in the colors of Homeland Security and you're reading Swamiji's words and the word toleration is kind of hitting you, it's as though his words are going into the four cardinal directions, which is the way that in the South Asian context we think of great words. They go into the four directions. And so Swamiji's legacy continues. This became a commemorative act for 9/11, and it closed on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. But our quest for different ways to connect Swamiji with the Art Institute continues, as more recently we demonstrated with showing M.F. Hussein's last works, which had a beautiful work called Tale of Three Cities. And in that too, Swamiji is front and center. So we will, as an art museum, continue to think about creative ways in which to keep Swamiji's legacy alive here today. Thank you. I'm happy to take a couple of questions. I know we don't have a lot of time, but yeah. I think there's a microphone coming, so please wait for that. And
that's a very beautiful representation of Swami Vivekananda's historic visit to Chicago. I've been living here since 1980, and I reminisce that every year, especially September 11th. The key here is, this is the exchange between two religious systems or dominions, which has crossed paths in 1893. The same time, something else is happening in South Africa, which you also can relate to, where similar things are happening among democracies. So my thought process here is, I wanted to ask you what the Nivedita was turned on or excited or enlightened by Swami Vivekananda in particular. I would like you to share that experience. Thank you.
I think, there is an interesting dialogue that takes place. I'm bringing the story back to Chicago, between the Hales, who he thinks of as his sisters, and Nivedita, when she joins him on that second trip to America. And there's this contrast in the way that they look at the master. Because for Mary Hale, she looks at him as, as a man of intellect. And Nivedita talks about him as a supplicant, as a follower, as her guru. And the Nivedita that you see with Vivekananda is very different from the Nivedita who later passionately writes about Swadeshi. I mean, she just evolves, but her surrender to Vivekananda was total, coming from the background that she came from. And this is something that is really, it reminds me, in fact, of the young Naren and his questioning with Ramakrishna, but eventually his complete surrender to Ramakrishna. Nivedita was not questioning. She was completely devoted to her master. And I think that was very hard for some of his other Western disciples to relate to. But I don't know, I feel ill-equipped to talk about them in front of, such renowned scholars such as Swami Ishratmananda. But my very modest understanding of Nivedita is primarily through the lens of her writings and particularly about Swadeshi and art. And her engagement with Okakura and that whole Tagore milieu, which is the world of Nivedita post her time with Swamiji. But I think it is the complete surrender that I find very interesting for someone who comes from her Western background and who was clearly a tremendous intellectual as well. Yeah, sorry, I heard. Yeah. Sure. The mic is there, but yeah. Yeah.
I would be interested to know if he had company during his travel to the US and while in the US. Was he alone by himself or he had a team with him? One reason is that before he came to the US, he also went to China in the same trip on his way to Canada. He went to China first, and then he went to Japan.
Yes,
and
that
in
was
Japan,
just the
he
ship.
visited 4 cities.
Yeah.
And then took the ship again to Canada, where he took 2 trains to come to the Minnesota, and then took another train. So it was a very extensive and a complicated journey. So how did he manage this? As a person, individual, one would like to know in those days.
So from what I understand, his original trip, the first trip that you're talking about, the trip in 1893, he traveled alone to Chicago, and some of the travels prior to the Parliament. Of course, once the Parliament had taken place, he was invited to speak in many different places. And he was in America for 4 more years. And of course, there were times when he was, in different places with groups of people. For example, there is this time when he spends at Green Acres, which is much written about, and other places like that. So, of course, he's constantly preaching. He is surrounded by a lot of people. It's almost like there are 2 parts to that trip, the pre-Parliament and the celebrity Vivekananda afterwards, the monk who's no longer unknown. But on the second trip to America, he is certainly accompanied by Nivedita and another of his fellow brothers. And then there are, again, different journeys that they go on. And also in both of the trips, he also travels to Europe. He travels extensively, even on the second trip, before he goes back. And so there are different stretches where he's traveling with different people. And of course, he's constantly meeting other people. But there are also times when he does want to be alone. But there's much more engagement in, particularly by the second trip. But by then, he is also visiting familiar places and familiar people. And many of his disciples are also actively getting engaged in helping him get to know other people. So I think there's a contrast between when he's the unknown monk versus what is happening afterwards. Yes.
Just to add, the wife of Michigan governor and Rockefeller were impressed by and Tesla were impressed by Vivekananda, and they help him.
Yes.
But before Parliament, he has written so many letters to Calcutta and India about the money.
Correct.
Just to answer your question.
Yeah, true. Of course, a lot of what we know at this time is through his letters, and of course, the accounts of other people. I think at this point we should end this talk, and we can always continue to chat afterwards, but thank you so much for coming, and I hope you will get a chance to go into the galleries. Thank you.